They say all is fair in love and war, but all is not fair. Why do the good die young? Why does evil prosper? In this series, love and war find their beginning.
You knock these buildings down, we'll hear all of us.
Birds literally dropped from the sky.
But scientists warn the worst is yet to come.
Only by knowing their past do we get clues as to how the story ends.
Every night on the TV news is like a nature hike through the book of Revelation.
This is only the beginning.
Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bound. How quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
I want you to really understand the emotions that so many were experiencing. Miller, the farmer turned preacher, on one of his speaking engagements, catches the attention of a young girl named Ellen Harmon. The Guardians had attempted to give insight into what the future held to two other men, but those men had refused to share what they had been shown. So the Guardians began to give this girl dreams and visions and show her what was coming on the nation because of the rejection of the light. The idea of humans receiving visions and dreams seems like an ancient concept. The seers and the prophets in history came at pivotal moments in the history of nations. Miller and Harmon and others began to share their hope that the end of this long controversy was near, and scores of people who called themselves Christians were rejecting the message. But they weren't just rejecting the idea of the hope of the return of Yeshua. They were rejecting other light that was flooding on the scene. The idea that a God who tortures people in hellfire was and is not found in Scripture. The Scriptures are clear that the dead sleep rather than pass on into paradise and communicate with the living. Many rejected the truth that the weekly holy day was actually the seventh day rather than the first day of the week. The very things the Scriptures foretold would happen were now coming to pass. And Christians, they had no protection from this last deception of Lucifer and his legions. And just for context, at this time in the mid-1800s, it seemed more likely that spiritualism would become the religion of America than in the year 156 that Christianity would be the religion of the Roman Empire, or in 756 that Islam would be to the Arabian Peninsula. Most today think that the United States is mostly Christian. But if we really pin down the belief system of millions, we might more easily label them as adherents of spiritualism, the religion of Lucifer. When you reject light, the doors of the soul are flung open to darkness. And everyone was rejecting the teachings of the Scriptures, so they naturally wanted to believe that their loved ones were happily living in Jannah and that the living could communicate with these spirits of ancestors and departed loved ones at will. The country was increasingly divided on the issue of slavery. The day was July 4, 1850. President Zachary Taylor is not as friendly to the southern states and their desire for the expansion of slavery. And history says that he comes home from a nice holiday and eats a bowl of cherries. He's dead a few days later. Suspicions start swirling that Jesuits had taken an oath to subvert the U.S. Constitution, and many believed that they were behind Millard Fillmore. And soon after this, Fillmore became president and quickly moved through Congress all that Taylor had been against. In September of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act is voted and strengthened. Just for context, in this moment in history, there are more people who are communing with the dead, spiritualists, than who are against the abolition of slavery. The Fugitive Slave Act was a law that stated that any slave who escaped to a northern state was by law to be returned to his or her slave master. By the North complying, they were aiding and abetting slavery, and the law resulted in the conscription and kidnapping of free blacks into slavery. They had no rights, no defense in court, so they were in essence being hunted. And this made things worse. Northern businessmen supported the law because they had strong financial ties with slave owners in the South. It would be fair for us to ask where Jah was in all of this. Where were the guardians? Or how about, where were the faithful? Those who followed the teachings of Yeshua. As the tensions rose, the young girl getting these visions from the guardians, Ellen, now married, was standing in front of a group of church parishioners on a cold winter's day in Parkville, Michigan on January 12, 1861. It would be just 3 months later when the first shot of the Civil War was fired at Fort Sumter. The guardians showed her in vision what was soon to take place in this country. Here's what she said that day. There is not a person in this house who has even dreamed of the trouble that is coming upon this land. People are making sport of the secession ordinance of South Carolina, but I have just been shown that a large number of states are going to join that state, and there will be a most terrible war. In this vision, I have seen large armies of both sides gather on the field of battle. I heard the booming of the cannon and saw the dead and dying on every hand. Then I saw them rushing up, engaged in hand-to-hand fighting, bayoneting one another. And then I saw the field after battle, all covered with the dead and dying. Then I was carried to prisons and saw the suffering of those in want, who were wasting away. Then I was taken to the homes of those who had lost husbands, sons, or brothers in the war. I saw their distress and anguish. She then goes on to say, then looking slowly around the house, there are those in this house who will lose sons in that war. As with most warnings, few listened, but some did. The Underground Railroad was at a peak, and the guardians were helping men and women, boys and girls, escape the evils of the plantations. The war the guardians fight that we cannot see is as real as the ones that we can see. But it wasn't just Ellen that the guardians were working with. You don't develop the courage and resolve of President Abraham Lincoln overnight. The guardians had been planting seeds with him through his whole life, all for this moment. This nation had yet to achieve her divine calling. While Miller and Ellen and others were sharing what was being shown to them, other guardians were working on using Lincoln as well. The preferred method is always to work through sincere followers of the light. But there are times when the leader of a nation can do more in a moment than a common person can in a lifetime. The guardians tried to help Lincoln see what was really going on. The guardians had seen this scene long before. They remembered it well. It was that revolt led by Lucifer in the city of Janah. And these were the same tactics to divide and conquer. But the temptations in Lincoln's life were many. His wife, for one. As with any mother that loses a child, Mary Lincoln was overwhelmed with grief. But rather than hold on to hope and follow the light, she went looking into the darkness, and she loved to communicate with the dead. At this time, as the war broke out and the casualties began piling up, you can understand why it's in times of mass casualty when the desire to speak to the dead is the greatest. Another factor that few know of is that the legions of fallen angels from Janah were revealing themselves to the generals on both sides of the war, appearing as the spirits of their friends, dead warriors, and the fathers of the Revolutionary War. These generals were seeking counsel among the dead on how to wage war. Lincoln did attend a few seances with his wife, but it was said that he was always suspicious of it all. Lincoln stayed in contact with a friend, a priest. They were very open with each other. They'd write letters to one another. Here's an excerpt from one of those letters from Lincoln dated June 8, 1864. And he writes, "Dear friend, this war would never have been possible without the sinister influence of the Jesuits. We owe it to popery that we now see our land reddened with the blood of her noblest sons. It is the promises of the Jesuits, the money and the arms. The Protestants of both the North and the South would surely unite to exterminate the Jesuits if they could hear the plots made in Rome to destroy this republic." He goes on to say, "Unfortunately, I feel more and more every day that it is not against the Americans of the South alone that I am fighting. It is more against the Pope of Rome, his perfidious Jesuits, and their blind and bloodthirsty slaves, than against the real American Protestants that we have to defend ourselves. Here is the real danger of our position. So long as they will hope to conquer the North, they will spare me, but the day we will rout their armies, and that day will surely come with the help of God, take their cities and force them to submit, then it is my impression that the Jesuits, who are the principal rulers of the South, will do what they have almost invariably done in the past. The dagger or the pistol of one of their adepts will do what the strong hands of the warriors could not achieve. This civil war seems to be nothing but a political affair to those who do not see, as I do, the secret springs of that terrible drama. But it is more a religious than a civil war. It is Rome who wants to rule and degrade the North, as she has ruled and degraded the South from the very day of its discovery. There are only very few of the Southern leaders who are not more or less under the influence of the Jesuits through their wives, family relations, and their friends. Several members of the family of Jeff Davis belong to the Church of Rome." He goes on to say, "Even the Protestant ministers are under the influence of the Jesuits without suspecting it. To keep her ascendancy in the North as she does in the South, Rome is doing here what she has done in Mexico and in all the South American republics. She is paralyzing by a civil war the arms of the soldiers of liberty, and she divides our nation in order to weaken, subdue, and rule it." End quote. You know, there's a reason the war didn't end as quickly as it should have. Ellen was also writing what the Guardians were showing her, and here's what she had to say in her letter. "The North have had no just idea of the strength of the accursed system of slavery. It is this and this alone which lies at the foundation of the war. The South have been more and more exacting. They consider it perfectly right to engage in human traffic, to deal in slaves and the souls of men. Thousands have lost their lives, and many have returned to their homes maimed and crippled for their life. Their health is gone and their earthly prospects are forever blighted, and yet how little has been gained. Thousands have been induced to enlist with the understanding that this war was to exterminate slavery. But now that they are fixed, they find that they have been deceived. That the object of this war is not to abolish slavery, but to preserve it as it is. Some have been taken prisoners by the rebels, a fate more to be dreaded than death. The prospects before our nation are discouraging, for there are those filling responsible stations who are rebels at heart. There are commanding officers who are in sympathy with the rebels, and while they are desirous of having the Union preserved, they despise those who are anti-slavery. And God is punishing this nation for the high crime of slavery. He has the destiny of the nation in His hands, and He will punish the South for the sin of slavery, and the North for so long suffering its overreaching and overbearing influence. The fugitive slave law was calculated to crush out of man every noble, generous feeling of sympathy that should arise in his heart for the oppressed and suffering slave. It was in direct opposition to the teaching of Christ. God's scourge is now upon the North because they have so long submitted to the advances of the slave power. And the sin of Northern pro-slavery men is great. They have strengthened the South in their sin by sanctioning the extension of slavery. They have acted a prominent part in bringing this nation into its present distressed condition." End quote. The nation was crying out to God, but Ellen was warning all who would listen about the real issues going on. She goes on to write, "Some of our leading men in Congress also are constantly working to favor the South. In this state of things, proclamations are issued for national fasts, for prayer that God will bring this war to a speedy and favorable termination. As Isaiah 58 says, 'Is not this the fast that I have chosen? To loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, and to let the oppressed go free, and that you break every yoke? Is it not to deal thy bread to the hungry, and that thou bring the poor that are cast out to thy house? When thou seest the naked, that thou cover him, and that thou hide not thyself from thine own flesh.'" She writes, "I saw that these national fasts were an insult to Jehovah. He accepts of no such fasts. The recording angel writes in regard to them, 'You fast for strife and debate, and to smite with the fist of wickedness.' I was shown how our leading men have treated the poor slaves, who have come to them for protection. Angels have recorded it. Instead of breaking their yoke and letting the oppressed go free, these men have made the yoke more galling for them than when in the service of their tyrannical masters. Love of liberty leads the poor slaves to leave their masters and risk their lives to obtain liberty. Lucifer was the first great leader in rebellion." She writes, "God is punishing the North that they have so long suffered the accursed sin of slavery to exist. For in the sight of heaven, it is a sin of the darkest dye. God is not with the South, and he will punish them dreadfully in the end." Lucifer is the instigator of all rebellion. You know, the Guardians were asked to get involved in the war at the Battle of Bull Run, and what might have led to a quick end to the war, but one of the Guardians was asked to interfere and prolong it. All had to see why this judgment had come on this country. And at the same time, the Guardians were working with President Lincoln to end slavery, while some just wanted to end the war and maintain slavery. You can see this battle going on. It was fierce. But the 13th Amendment was passed just before the second inauguration of Lincoln. But he was clear in his second inaugural address, just as Ellen was clear on the issues of the war. And I want to share with you some of Lincoln's words from that second inaugural address, inscribed on the walls of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. today. "Fellow countrymen, at this second appearing to take the oath of the presidential office, there is less occasion for an extended address than there were at the first. On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it, all sought to avert it. While the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war, insurgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects by negotiation. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish. And the war came. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union even by war. while the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it. Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration which it has already attained. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes His aid against the other. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. Let us judge not, that we be not judged. Lincoln goes on to say, the prayers of both could not be answered. That of either has been answered fully. The Almighty has His own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come. But woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses, which in the providence of God must needs come, but which having continued through His appointed time, He now wills to remove, and that He gives to both the North and South this terrible war, as the woe due to those by whom the offenses came, shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to Him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue, until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. As was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Soon after his inauguration speech, Lincoln wrote to his friend Charles, the priest, a letter which read, "Man must not care where and when he will die, provided he dies at the post of honor and duty. But I may add today that I have a presentiment that God will call me to Him through the hand of an assassin." A month after this speech, Lincoln was assassinated. But the spirit of rebellion and division is swelling again today in this country, and it is inspired by the same rebel leader who starts all war, Lucifer. He's preparing for one last conflict in which the whole world will be involved. But the guardians are preserving this nation a little longer to fulfill its ultimate destiny.